Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second thinning meeting for the Hudson Valley. We have Terrence Robinson here with us to start things off.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to join you again to talk about thinning. What a very interesting year we're in, as they all are, but especially this one. A week ago, we talked about pedal fall thinning, and the temperatures were cool and the carbon balance was positive, and it seemed like it would be difficult or little thinning from that spray. And then in just a week, we come right back at the 10 to 13 millimeter timing with very, very different weather conditions and very different predicted thinning outcomes from the carbon balance model. I want to emphasize here at the beginning that the fruit growth rate model, if used after the pedal fall spray, can really inform and help us guide us in this 10 millimeter spray. I think that not many people measured fruit because of at least one person told me, well, it's a cool pedal fall and probably won't get much out of it. It's not worth the time and effort. And that's probably okay, but I still wish people would measure fruits to really know where we're sitting at this moment for this upcoming spray, because the spray is going to happen during days that are relatively warm. Now, the carbon balance model is going to be extremely helpful to us in interpreting this data. Let me just summarize briefly my understanding of things in the Hudson Valley, and I rely a lot on other people's eyes for this. But despite a little bit of frost damage in some blocks and cool weather, there seemed to be a fairly good fruit set, initial fruit set in the valley. So that would require several thinning sprays. The challenge was that the pedal fall spray went on under cool conditions with a carbohydrate surplus, and thus probably gave very mild thinning. The opposite is going to happen now with the 10 to 13 millimeter spray, which will go on under much warmer conditions and will likely give great thinning. Here, the challenge is not to overthin. We continue to suggest that you time this spray based upon degree days using the degree day calculator in the Cornell carbohydrate model website. And we're suggesting you try to time this thinning spray at 200 to 250 degree days. I ran the model for Milton area just because it's kind of a major hub of the fruit growing area. And it shows this very interesting change that's happened since last week. I have here listed a full bloom date in April the 27th. And then we were at a negative carbohydrate balance for the most of the bloom period. But as we got closer to pedal fall, temperatures cooled way down and we got into this very positive carbohydrate balance, which is not what we want to get good thinning from pedal fall. Interestingly enough, I just got off a Zoom call with the growers in the Champlain Valley. They're looking at applying their pedal fall spray under this deficit condition. They'll probably get really great pedal fall thinning results. But starting on about the 12th of May, things started to decline. It was still positive, crossing zero on about the 15th. And then it's gone quite negative, down somewhere around minus 35 grams carbohydrate, just as we're to enter this window for thinning at the 10 to 13 millimeters. So the big question is, how many fruits are out there? How aggressive do we need to be? We have what appears to be just excellent thinning conditions. But I'd like to stop my presentation right now and ask Dan if he could just try to answer that question and talk about some data that he's just been able to measure, which I think will be very, very helpful. So Dan, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Terrence. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, everybody see that screen okay? All right. So we've set up 3 precision thinning trials in the Milton area. So this corresponds with the carbohydrate data that Terrence just showed. These 3 varieties are in the same block, and they're actually the same block I used last year for Gala and Pink Lady. And I can compare the data, though I haven't gotten to that yet. But let's look at the overall picture here. For the Pink Lady and the Honeycrisp, the first application went on a week ago Saturday. No, it was a week ago Sunday. It was 10 parts acid and a quart per 100 of carbaryl. So the grower followed our recommendations at the time. Remember, we were looking at cold weather, strong carbohydrate balance, and relatively poor thinning conditions. So our recommendation was to increase rates and rely on carbaryl for really be the workhorse of the thinning this season. So the grower did implement that. The Gala were actually, the Honeycrisp received the 10 parts and the double rate of carbaryl. The Pink Lady received half that, or 5 parts and 1 pint per 100. The Gala was sprayed 2 days later, that is a week ago, last Tuesday, and that was 10 parts and 2 quarts. The initial measurement was made on a Saturday around noontime, technically a day late based on the degree day accumulation, but we had a re-entry interval issue in the orchard, so I couldn't do it on Friday. So this is today's data. So 3 days later, and if you might remember in the e-alert I published a few days ago, the Saturday ratings. So overall fruitlet diameter, this of course includes fruitlets that are likely to fall off. It was around 4.1 to 4.3 3 days ago. So that has increased. The average of the largest fruits, if you recall, the Honeycrisp was around 9 millimeters 3 days ago, and now it's 13 on the 15 largest on the largest fruits. And the Gala were around 8, and the Pink Lady were around 8. So we've had quite an increase in size with these warm temperatures since Saturday. Potential fruit set was quite high. I want to point out the Honeycrisp is a very high density system, 2.5 by 11, 1,584 trees per acre. Hence, our target in the Honeycrisp is 50 fruits per tree, which is somewhere just over 1,000 bushel per acre on an eighth leaf orchard. The Gala and Pink Lady are also eighth leaf, but they're more vigorous trees, filled in more of the space, and we target them at 120 fruits per acre. And you can see as of this afternoon, this data is only about 30 minutes old, that on the Gala, we've come quite close. We're at 187 when our target's 120. Pink Lady, 253 over 120. So we're a little off on the Pink Lady, and the Honeycrisp at 97 when our target is 50. And I may have misspoke. The Pink Lady did not receive a blossom spray. So for the Pink Lady, it was petal fall, 5 parts, 1 pint per 100. The Gala was at bloom 10 parts, then petal fall 10 parts plus a quart per 100, and the Honeycrisp was the same program. So if we look at the classic charts, we can see on the Honeycrisp that the percent clusters we need to set, plant flowers we need to set, we need 6%, but we're at 13% in the Honeycrisp. But here again, 97 fruits, and our target is 50. So we did quite well with that, with the Honeycrisp. Moving on to the Pink Lady, not so well. We're still only halfway there in terms of percent flowers set. And again, fruit-wise, just about the same. We still have a long ways to go. And finally, in the Gala, again, we're relatively close in the Gala for this point in time. We have 187 projected fruit set on a target of 120. So we're getting close there. Now, in the Gala and the Pink Lady, and particularly the Gala, looking at those trees, I would say that the bottom half of the trees are about where they need to be, while the top half of the trees are still too heavy. And we saw this in this block last year, and I think it's a a classic problem with a mature tall spindle where we start to shade the bottoms and we have less fruit set in the bottoms. So I would say when these get hit again this week, that is strictly a spray into the tops of the trees here. And with that, just a few comments in general as I call around and as I look around. As we discussed last week, you know, the indicators for fruit set were good, and I think our fruit set is really solid. The only thing that looks a little iffy has been Empire. Reports seem to be consistent coming in that we have a full crop of Empire, but there are many missing kings, so it's definitely a side set there. And we're in 2s and 3s when many of our other varieties are in 3s, 4s, and even 5. Galas are particularly well set, I guess, as usual, and will be a particular challenge to thin this year. I had some kings missing in some Honeycrisp, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And again, our biennial varieties, you know, where the bloom came back, they look great. Some blocks though, Fuji, Honeycrisp in particular, some golden, the bloom hasn't come back as well. So bottom line, it looks like under the conditions of bloom and petal fall this year, you know, our recommendation of upping the rates and going with a stronger carbaryl mix did hit the mark, at least in these 3 varieties in this orchard site. And with that, I will get out and turn back over to Terrence.
Well, thanks, Dan. That to me is just exciting data. Just to me shows the true value of having these fruit growth rate measurements. It gives you a solid footing on which to base your next step. But I want to emphasize that the good results with both Honeycrisp and with Gala were the result of a combined effort at bloom and a petal fall effort. So if it was probably only one or the other, the results would have been not quite so impressive. The results with the Pink Lady show we still got quite a ways to go to get that thinned down better. And maybe looking back, we could have put the rate a little bit higher on the Pink Lady. Instead of 5 parts, gone to 7.5 parts or something. But it is an easier to thin variety than is Gala. But at petal fall timing under cool conditions like we see on this slide, I really expected mild thinning. And so I'm very pleased with sort of the good results by upping the rate of both NAA and of carbaryl. For those of you who have not done that sort of aggressive program, you're likely looking at a much greater fruit number. Let's just use that target of 120 fruits. If you're well over 200 and you're say 300 fruits still on the tree, you've still got a big thinning job to do. In the examples that Dan gave with the Honeycrisp, he's only 47 fruits over his target. And with Gala, he's only, you know, less than 100 fruits over his target. So he's done really, really well. But I would guess that in most cases that didn't use the more aggressive approach combined with blossom thinning, you're probably looking at a substantial fruit number to thin at this point in time. The good news is I think we've got just wonderful conditions to get good, hard, aggressive thinning where we need it. We're looking at sort of just almost the perfect situation for thinning, if that's what you need, is aggressive thinning. With that very positive result comes some risk. I told you last week at the petal fall timing, there's very little risk of overthinning, but today there is some risk. And how much of a risk is still not clear, but I think there is some risk. I want to focus now on, let's time this next spray. On the bottom part of the chart, you see in the column for accumulated degree days, 4 degrees C since bloom. We highlight with a border around the cells the period between 200 and 250. So today's May the 18th. And in Milton, by the end of the day, you will have accumulated the 200-degree days. So the window opens at the end of today. And it will continue up for 4 more days. So we have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at least, well, 3 more days, today plus 3 more, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday to time this particular spray. Now, it's only a 3-day window because the temperatures are high and every day we accumulate like 20-degree days. On cool years, that window might be 5 days wide, but today or this year, it's only going to be 3 days wide. Now, what happens if you don't get your spray on by the 21st and you carry over to Saturday, the 22nd? It'll still work. But the best timing when you need thinning is between 200 and 250. Now, I would like to secondly have you notice the color change in these 3 columns that started back on May 17th. Prior to that, if you scrolled up on the chart, they were all green. That scale is up here at the top, meaning that thinning efficacy was going to be good. And even before that, it was blue, meaning very mild during petal fall. But now, beginning on the 17th, it switches to a pink color. And that means thinning is going to be very good. It's not red yet, meaning that it would over thin, but it is a point to consider that you have to be careful, know what you're doing here, know how much thinning you need before you decide how much chemical to use. In a general sense, when it switches to pink, my recommendation is to slightly reduce rates, and you'll see that over here on the right-hand side, to decrease rates over the next 3 days to thin by 15%. Now, that decision has to be made by every single person based upon their situation. If you're looking at hundreds and hundreds of extra fruits on your tree, you need every bit of thinning you can get, and maybe you don't want to reduce rates. But if you're relatively good and you've thinned somewhat already and the bloom wasn't excessive, this is a place where you can overthin, and therefore decreased rates would be the appropriate action. So I really want to encourage you to run the model, carbohydrate model, for your location. Plug in your full bloom date and your green tip date, and then plug in how strong the bloom was, whether essentially snowball bloom, which would be 100% of the flowers open, or you had only 50% bloom, because that makes a difference in what we suggest. There are 3 places to access this, and I'm sure Mike could probably quickly put all of these up in the chat box, but there's the NUA site at Cornell. There is the MaluSim website, and then there's the MaluSim phone app that you can download. I said this last week, but I'll repeat it. There is a 2021 version of the phone app. So I would ask that if you had it on your phone last year, you trash that app and download it again with the 2021 version. Now, there are a couple of generalized rules. I don't like to spray. In fact, I like to wait it out if carbohydrate average deficits are below -60. Now, let's go back 1 slide. The average so far for Milton is going to be somewhere in the -30. Now, there is, -40 on a 1 day or 2 days, but the average over 7 days is -30. So we're not yet at this worrisome level of -60 or less. So it's still appropriate to thin. You just have to know what you're doing. The second major point is that at this moment, over the 16-year study we did, you get the greatest bang for your buck, the most efficacy out of any thinner between 10 and 13 millimeters fruit size. So that means they're great and they're potent, but the risk level also increases. And there is a small risk of overthinning with large carbohydrate deficits, at least the ones we're seeing right now. I hesitate to even say that because I don't want to give anybody the jitters or make you back away from thinning. I think it's really wonderful that we've got this level of deficit this year. It'll help us thin. We can get just tremendous good action and probably end up just right on the money with our blocks if we don't become too concerned and too cautious. So the carbohydrate model is telling us that this next 3 days is the window to put on your 10 millimeter, 13 millimeter spray, and we'll have a significant deficit that's going to give us very good thinning. But I want to emphasize the deficits are not so large that we should avoid thinning. So don't chicken out. Some additional suggestions. So it looks like that the best timing is Tuesday through Friday for the mid-Hudson Valley region. Now, you had to run it for Northern Columbia County. It might be a little different, probably is a little different. It might be Wednesday through Saturday. Now, I put here that the best timing is Tuesday through Saturday, even though the model says Tuesday through Friday, because I think Saturday essentially will give you the same response as if you sprayed either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, or Friday. So I'm extending, even though if you go back to the carb model to the degree days, I really think there's a 5-day window. Started today. During all those 5 days, temperatures are going to be in and around 80, a little bit higher, a little bit lower. And the carbohydrate balance is going to bounce around minus 30. This is perfect for strong thinning. So in general, I think we should reduce rates by 15%. It's not a lot. So for example, with some of the hard to thin varieties where I might have a high rate of 10 parts or 2 parts like we did at Pelifol, here I would use substantially less. I want to just jump to Maxell. Maxell is a thinner that excels when temperatures are above 75. And that's what we expect to see this year. So for many varieties, I'm going to show you I'll get to it in the next slide, that is probably a perfect year to use Maxell on many varieties. It is a little more expensive, but it really does a fabulous job when you have these kinds of temperatures. I want to just have you note here on this forecasted, whether it actually happens or not, I don't know. But by May 24th, which is Monday, we will already be at 300 degree days because it's going to stay warm, 20 degree days every day. So we'll probably be at 15 millimeters by Monday. And that's where we start to lose the ability to thin very much. So don't wait too long. If we get into Monday and Tuesday and we just not getting any thinning done, then we've got to consider rescue treatments. Now, this will be a difficult a year to try to measure fruits and get the answer before you have to decide on this rescue treatment. But let's just go through an example. Let's suppose you sprayed today when there's 200 degree days. I suggest you wait 50 to make your first measurement on fruit growth. That would be on the 21st. 21st is Friday. No, 21st is, I have to look at a calendar. Who can tell me the 21st, the day of the week? We're on the 18th, it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's Friday. So your first measurement would be on Friday, but then we're going to wait 120 after that. So at 220, we would, at 320, we would want to take the second measurement, which would be next Tuesday. But if you did what Dan did, take the measurements and then decide that same day what to do, that's still within the window for a rescue treatment if you need it. So that's how I think you should time your fruit growth measurements. I kind of think you won't need that rescue treatment this year. I think you'll have very good success with this spray and probably be done. So let me go over some options and some specific recommendations, and we can talk about others in the question and answer period. But there's really 4 different things you can spray at this time. I mean, 7-in oil is a possibility. It's used a lot in Pennsylvania, and it is a potent thinner if oil is used because of the penetrating action of oil. We don't use it that much in New York, mostly because we're using Captan in our fungicide programs. If you're going to use oil, you have to leave Captan out 7 days before and not use Captan for 7 days after, or you can get potential fruit marking and roughened lenticels and some russeting. So the most common things for us are Maxellin 7 or NA 7, or for the farmers that are trying to eliminate carbaryl from their spray program for a marketing purpose, Maxellin NAA is an option. So let's start with Gale. This is a great year to use Maxell, and you'll really help yourself in fruit size with this dose of Maxell. So it's going to require a full dose. Now I have listed here the full dose, but I want to emphasize I'm suggesting you reduce it by 15%, which would be about 10 ounces less. But let's just go forward with how this would work. 64 ounces of Maxell on a tree row volume dilute basis. Tree row volume dilute basis, plus 1 pint of carbaryl. I'm going to just digress for a minute and define that again for you, even though we try to do it every year. If you have relatively young or thin, very two-dimensional hedgerow, tall spindles, and your tree row volume is essentially 100 gallons, and you spray 100 gallons, then your factor is 1. You just put 64 ounces in every 100 gallons and spray. But if you have a more three-dimensional tall spindle orchard, and it's tall and mature, and it really measures as a 200-gallon dilute orchard, then you've got to use a concentration factor of 2. So my recommendations is on 100 gallons dilute basis. Now you're only spraying 100 gallons, but you really should be spraying 200 gallons. So you have to double that. So and for many tall spindle blocks that are fully grown, that are really 200-gallon orchards, it really is twice that, a gallon of Maxell per acre and a pint of 7. The same principle applies to these later recommendations with NA. Now for Honeycrisp, NA at 3 ounces, tree row volume dilute basis, and a pint of carbaryl just works wonders at this timing with this kind of heat. With Macintosh, I tend to like lower rates, just 2 ounces of NA, tree row volume dilute basis, and pint of carbaryl. Now for Empire, I like the higher Maxell rate, but I hadn't heard what Dan just said earlier, that Empire set doesn't look that great with a lot of kings gone. And so if that's the case, I probably would ratchet down my Empire recommendation to only 48 ounces on a tree row volume dilute basis plus carbaryl. This is a year where both Spurdelicious and Fuji can be thinned very successfully with Maxell at the high rate of 64 ounces on a tree row volume dilute basis. Now, I'm sure you have other varieties in mind. If you would like to talk about them, we can do that in the chat box or in the question and answer period later. There will be some of you that spray this spray and say, I'm done. I'm just going to live with whatever I've got. But there's others of you that will want to know if you really did get close to the target or whether you need to spray one more time. And the only way to really know that is to tag spurs and measure fruitlets. I want to emphasize that we're trying to convince people to measure the fruitlets at 50 degree days after application and at 120 degrees after application. In the MaluSim phone app, it's the fruit growth rate model is in there. You can enter the data by voice or by typing it in with your fingers. It's very easy to use, but you have to use the new version, the 2021 version. So delete last year's version of MaluSim, install the new version, because the new version has error detection protocols to help make sure you get the right answer. So I'm going to summarize and then open it up for questions. There are differences around, and the more I hear, the more I worry that you'll take a recommendation from me to put it on everywhere. I really encourage you to assess each block, find out if the kings are there. If they're missing, then you would lower rates. But you can't be afraid to thin just because the kings are missing, because you can have way too many fruits composed of laterals. But if most kings are present, use full rates, but because of the heat, just reduce the rate a little bit, 15%. Try to time your spray to get it on between now, which is around 200 degree days, and 3 days from now when you'll be at 250. If you don't make it and you're at 270, it'll still work, but it won't be quite as effective. I really encourage you to assess the response measuring fruitlet diameter using the fruit growth rate model, because that will allow you to come back in around 330, 340, 350 degree days and spray one more time if needed. I really think, though, that very few people will need to do that. I think this year everybody's going to be pretty happy with what they get out of this 10 millimeter spray. Now for the 10 millimeter spray, I like to even concentrate more of the spray in the top of the tree than even previously. I said last week that at bloom, I want a uniform distribution because we're trying to spray every spur with a similar amount of ATS or NA. But once we go to petal fall, then you need to concentrate the spray, and the normal is 2/3 in the top, 1/3 in the bottom. But once we get to the 10 millimeter spray, almost always the bottoms are thinned enough, or will be with just a little bit of drift down. And so Pollyanna and I, and even before she came, I did several years of work showing that even no spray in the bottom often gave us the best distribution. So our firm recommendation is for this spray, make sure that only 25% of the spray gets put in the bottom half of the tree. This requires re-nozzling, but it's worth it that you'll get more thinning in the top where you need it and very little in the bottom. Now, where there has been frost damage, just completely shut off the bottom nozzles because often the bottom part of the tree has already been thinned by the frost. Because of the heat, I would suggest you not use Regulate. There's just too much carbohydrate deficit this year, and there is this risk of overthinning that I think Regulate will introduce into the mix. Don't use oil. But if you get in a situation where you need that rescue spray late next week, then you'll need to add oil to get any response. Because once fruits grow beyond 16 millimeters, they respond or the leaves don't absorb as much, or the fruits don't respond. There's almost zero response to NAA, but there's still some response to Maxell, but only if you have oil with it. So with that sort of summary, I'd be happy to take any questions and continue the discussion. One more, please. Send me your data on fruit diameters and I'll look at it for you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Terrence. If anybody has any questions, do they have the ability to unmute, Sarah?
I believe I do. We do have one question, which is following up on, what happens if the tops are heavier. So if only the tops need thinning, should an adjustment be made to the tree row volume?
Yes. So the easiest thing is just to shut off the bottom nozzles. Then you're not getting as much on per acre as you think you are because you're not using half the nozzles. But if those nozzles are small nozzles anyway, you're still getting 75%. And I think that generally works okay. The technical way to do it is to increase the amount so you're putting the full amount just through those top nozzles. But I think because of the heat this year, I'd just as soon not do that. Just shut off bottom nozzles and keep your same tree roll volume calculation as you had it before. That will give slightly less total amount per acre, but I still think it'll do well in the top.
Thank you. We have a question about Pink Lady. They easily overthin. Do you have a current recommendation for Pink Lady?
Yeah, so we generally, in the heat, we want to be very cautious with Pink Lady. So it's even easier to overthin than is Macintosh. Well, with Macintosh, we would put on 2 parts per million of NA, or no, 2 ounces of NA, which is 5 parts. But with Pink Lady, we go down to half that, 2.5 parts of NA, which is basically a little more than an ounce per 100 with some carbaryl, only 1 pint of carbaryl, not the quart. It reminds me a lot of our early days with ginger gold, where we routinely and consistently overthin ginger gold. But once we learn to thin it very lightly, we tend to do pretty well.
Okay, we have another question, and this is whether your recommendation is based on the assumption that NAA, NAD, or caustic was used at bloom, and then NAA or NAD plus 7 was used at petal fall.
So the recommendations I gave are based on the assumption that you sprayed at least the petal fall treatment that we suggested. If this is your very first thinning spray and you've not done anything up until now, then you probably would want to use the full rate and not reduce it by the 15%. But assuming you at least did on the petal fall spray, or better yet, you did both the bloom and the petal fall spray, then the recommendations are really sound.
We have another question. What about Maxell only on Pink Lady for mild thinning and fruit size?
So that's a very good point, Jeff, and it's not one that I've tried, or Joel, it's not one that I've tried. But just to review, everybody will remember that Maxell by itself almost never gives us the thinning we want. And that's why we always mix it with carbaryl. Once we started mixing it with carbaryl, we got great luck with Maxell, especially when temperatures are above 75. So thinning with Maxell only could be a really good option for Pink Lady. I just haven't tried it.
Okay, Terrence, I'd like to have you comment on the use of Protone as a, I guess you could say, late thinner. And the setup is, or the story is, that I have an organic grower who has always hand thinned, has no experience with chemical thinning, but can never get around the orchard in time. So is always disappointed with the sizing of their fruit. And he thought, maybe I'll try Protone this year. What can you say about that?
So Protone is a product from Valent that is ABA, and it's labeled on grapes, and on grapes they use it to increase red color of red grapes. But it's not been labeled as a thinner for apple. We have tried ABA a number of times in a number of different experiments with Valent, but it generally would only thin when we mixed it with Maxell. So I don't think you'll get what he wants. But on the more positive side, another product from Valent, which is not available this year, but is coming down the pike either next year or the year after, is called Exceed. And it's ACC, which is an ethylene precursor. And that does thin when you have large fruit size. And I think it'll be a great addition to our repertoire of thinners once it's labeled. I don't know if it's going to have an OMRI approved, but it should, because it's a kind of product that's a green and made by this company Valent, which is good at making green products that can get an organic label.
Thanks. And speaking of products coming down the pike, and maybe you've already spoken about Brevis in a previous webinar, but there is some out on EUP this year in the Valley. So, growers may be talking about it. Can you make a few comments on Brevis?
Okay, so Brevis is another product that we've been testing for a number of years. It was labeled in Europe before the US, which is a little unusual. The company's name is Adama, and they were able to get it registered in Europe because that molecule already had a food label as a sugar beet defoliant. In the US, it had no food label at all, so they had to start from ground zero. So they've been using it about 5 years in Europe. And well, in their case, they don't have some of the things we have. And so it's one of the few products they can use, and it's working well. It works really well between 10 millimeters and 18 millimeters. We've had good success with it, and it's scheduled to be labeled for full label for the US in 2023 with little bits of EUP this year. I think it'll be another great tool in our toolbox once we get it. I see it slotting in to this large fruit size rescue treatment particularly. It is a photosynthesis inhibitor, so it creates its own carbon deficit. The challenge with that product will be heat. When you mix hot temperatures that produce their own carbohydrate deficit with a chemical that produces its own carbohydrate deficit, you can have way over thinning. So for most years, when temperatures are moderate, it'll be a great addition. On hot temperature years, it could be very, very difficult to manage.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions for Terrence?
Hey, Terrence, Bob Fix here. Evercrest, do you have any new information?
Yeah, so Evercrisp has been a challenge for me because I've done some trials, but not enough. And we seem to consistently overthin Evercrisp. And we seem to also struggle a bit to get the heavy bloom that we want on it. So our current recommendation is to thin it with a light dose. And what I tend to like is a low dose of Maxellin 7. I've not seen pygmies with problems with it from NAA, but because one of its parents is Fuji, I'm hesitant to use a lot of NAA on it. Plus, I think that's where I've tended to have the overthinning. But a low dose of Maxell with some carbaryl has seemed to work okay.
Yeah, this year I used a bloom thinner, or not bloom thinner, but a petal fall of carbaryl, and it looks like I don't need to do anything else, or maybe it overdid it. So it's very easy to thin.
Yep. So that's great. If you didn't put anything on at petal fall, then I would go with this low dose of Maxell with a little bit of carbaryl in it now. But on the issue, maybe I'll just jump in. I ended up talking a lot about this yesterday with Western New York, and I don't really want to have sort of Eastern New York not hear some of my thinking. In general, we've had a very disappointing year with Honeycrisp. Some blocks are beautiful, but there's a lot that just didn't come back with the bloom we wanted. And we did a lot last year to try to prevent that, but we've ended up back with less than we wanted. So we've been toying with the last at least 2 years with a different strategy, and I've been unwilling to talk about it yet because I don't want to cause anybody a catastrophe. But I've decided that yesterday got drug into it, and maybe I'd just go ahead today saying that this is not a full, well-researched recommendation, but it's my thinking. We typically have tried to promote return bloom with sprays of either NA or ethereal. They both work, starting on the longest day of the year, June 21st. Now that tends to work with varieties that have flower initiation in late June and July, and Fuji's one of them, and Jonagold is another, and other biennial varieties. But what we haven't given enough consideration to is what Pollyanna found was that Honeycrisp has its flower initiation much earlier. And so we've never really adjusted how early we start return bloom sprays. But that's the new sort of thinking that some guys in Washington started doing this with putting on ethereal at petal fall. And maybe some of you have heard of that and are considering it. What I think would work the best is to start ethereal sprays in particular, not just NAA, but ethereal, earlier than we have in the past, but not as early as petal fall. And this is my logic. Ethereal is a powerful thinner, and it's especially potent under heat. We've done a number of years of work with ethereal at not so much at petal fall, but at 10 millimeters and 18 millimeters. And when you get temperatures above 85, it can take all the fruit off the tree. So I never have recommended it just because of the risk. So if you spray Honeycrisp trees with a full dose of ethereal and you get heat, you're likely to way overthin the trees. So I think an alternative strategy to help prevent what happened this year is to start ethereal sprays earlier than we have in the past, but not as early as the crazy guys that are doing it out west. So what I'm trying to think about and what I'm doing and testing last year and this year is to start closer to 16 millimeters. Let's get the 10 millimeter spray on. When we get past 15 millimeters, the susceptibility or sensitivity of fruits to NA declines fast. There's almost no sensitivity to NA when we get 18 millimeters. There's still some sensitivity to Maxell and still some to ethereal, but if we start with essentially a half dose of ethereal at the 18 millimeters and then 25 millimeters and another half dose, and then go to the full dose of ethereal for 2 later sprays, I think we'll be overlapping the period of Honeycrisp flower initiation better than we have been with previous NA sprays. The problem is the amount of GA produced in the seeds. When the seeds are on the tree, they're all producing GA, and that counterbalances or is an inhibitor of flowering. Now, ethereal doesn't necessarily lower the GA level, but it counterbalances it. And it allows more flower initiation even when you have high GA loads. So the best of all worlds would be to do what Dan did, where he got Honeycrisp already down to 97 fruits per tree, and we haven't even put on the 10 millimeter spray yet. But even if every one of those fruits had 10 seeds, that's only 970 seeds. Then if he starts with some ethereal sprays at 16, 18 millimeters, I think that the balance between flower promoting hormones and GAs will be more favorable to get repeat bloom. I don't think we had that last year. Now there's another explanation related to drought that I don't need to want to talk about right now, but I think drought played a role in the very variable bloom that we see on many places across the state with Honeycrisp. So I throw that out there just as something you can try. It's not my recommendation yet. And if you thin all your fruits off, I warned you, the ethifon is very potent under heat. Long ramble to say that. Now, what other questions were there?
There's a question regarding the rate of Maxell to use on pink ladies.
Okay, so what I would use on pink ladies would be 36 ounces. So half of, not 36, 32 ounces, half of the 64 ounce rate.
Okay. We have someone asking about Bosc pears that are heavy after carbaryl at 10 parts per million NAA at petal fall.
Ooh, I'm glad someone asked about pears. I love to talk about pears because I'm very disappointed in NAA on pears. I just think that's a worthless thing. But we've had very good success with Maxell on both Bartlett and Bosc pears. The Bartlett, with heat like we're getting this year, will work beautifully. We're just on the late side, but you could still spray pears today and get tremendous response from basically 150 parts per million Maxell. Now we don't mix 7 with it on pears. We just spray the straight Maxell. With Bosc, I use half of that rate, and I've had very good success year in and year out with Bosc. Now, just an additional thing, so Bosc with Maxell at about 75 to 100 parts per million at this timing. Now, maybe it should have been a couple days ago because fruit size on pears is already big, I'm sure, in the Hudson Valley, but it'll still work. We then combine that with 4 sprays of low doses of ethereal, and we've had very good, consistent repeat bloom with Bosc pears for the last 5 years since we've been on this program.
Okay, we have a question about a rescue thinning recommendation for a non-carbaryl program.
With non-carbaryl at rescue, you have to have some oil in the mix. So the only thing that's worked well is Maxell at 100 parts per million with some oil. It works even better with carbaryl, but without the carbaryl, the oil takes the Maxell in. We've added NA to the mix without much additional benefit. If it makes you feel better, put some NA in there. But the truth is, the plants lose sensitivity to NA rapidly after 15 millimeters. By the time you get to 18, they're almost completely insensitive to NA. What rate of oil? That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked because it's a low rate. It's a pint per 100. Now, just to keep that in perspective, when we spray oil for scale or other things like that or my control, we're talking 2 gallons per 100. We're talking 1/8 of that, a pint per 100 of oil. It's just working as a surfactant, penetrant.
Okay, any other questions for Terrence? Well, if not, let's figure on next week having a final thinning webinar. I'm going to leave the timing open like I did this time by kind of a last minute decision to put this meeting off 28 hours. So we had the precision thinning data to look at. We may be in the same situation next week, and I'd like to have another round of pea thinning data to look at before we talk. So keep an eye on the e-alerts. You may get basically 24 hours notice about when the meeting is going to be. And again, any final questions? And if not, I'd like to say thank you to Terrence for joining us. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And everybody have good luck out there this week.